Hi students, welcome to the part B of the rapid revision for Nctech. Now students, if you see governance, corporate governance is one area that we have to consider. Now considering the pre-seen material students that we know directly, that means it is explicit, right students, the issues what we are observing in the governance. For example, 10% ownership multiplied by 3 directors, it is effectively giving you how much 30% stake, which is owned by the founders. Correct now, students, if I'm not mistaken. And also, students, another issue that is there in our case study is 70% is institutional investors at the moment. So, in that case, there is one challenge. We don't know. Sometimes they may form a union and they may ask a hedge fund to manage their funds, and that person who is educated may ask us to revise our corporate governance. Now, students, if you observe one thing, so this 30% only does all the activities. Now, if you observe students, example, appointment of auditors, there's a question mark, how it is done. Nominations, how it is done. That is another question mark. The biggest challenge for us is remuneration. How is the remuneration packages designed? And also students, the risk committee or the risk also is another major factor that we have to be considered with. And we are very, very clear that if this company is following corporate governance, where the founders doesn't have 30% ownership, that will be a very, very big challenge for everyone. Now, students, one thing that we have to consider is just remember, there are chances that this section will be tested. Definitely for sure, a 20 marks question can come. But again, students, it all depends on the exhibit. All depends on the exhibit. And students, sometimes they may ask situations that we didn't even think of. So always make sure that you give your first priority to the exhibit. Now students, I just want to give you a quick recap of this governance area so that it will be very, very easier for you all to think and understand and apply as well. So it's not challenging students, it's just simple and easier to understand and apply. So students, let's start working on this. So if you observe students, first thing, if I'm not mistaken, just to make your life simple and easier to understand this, first thing we have to understand the basics. So I'll just maintain here students, basics is very, very important and it's fundamental. So basics, very much important. And then students, if I'm not mistaken, after basics, the other factors that we have to effectively consider is, if I'm not mistaken, is something called the audit committee, or I can go for remuneration first, remuneration committee, because remuneration is the salary packages you pay to the employees. That is one more factor you have to be very much vigilant about. And the other thing, students, if I'm not mistaken, the audit committee, this is also a very much important thing. And then students, if I'm not mistaken, the other thing is just to keep in mind, it's the risk committee for your understanding. And nomination, students, I can just keep it aside. But one more important thing that they always test in the examination is called external reporting. Students, I think this is like integrated reporting, EMAS, ISO 14100. This can come in the task number 3. So just have an idea of that, students, before you go to the examination. So students, let's initially focus on the basics so that it will be very easier. So there is something called principal. Principal in simple language, students, owners. Principal is owners versus something called agents. Agents are employees, the employees in the organization. Principal versus agent. I believe this is very clear for the students, the terminology of principal and agent. It's not so complicated, students. Just remember that there is something called principal and agent for your understanding. Now, students, employees, or I can say management also will be a good point. Now, students, the biggest challenge at the moment for Nctech, it starts from here itself. The problem here is very clear. Founders, that is our owners, founders versus, if I'm not mistaken, students, founders versus the management, because if you observe in this case, the 3 founders are already the management versus the shareholder. Now it's a conflict of interest. Everyone is within the interconnected things. So this is what the examiner has clearly mentioned for the students even before you go to the exam. But don't memorize anything, students. Once again, your question, requirement, understanding of the verbs, all those things are important, but it's very explicitly clear that we are having a principal agency issue. I believe that is very, very clear for the students at the moment. And then students, if you observe the private sector, that means profit making organization, the PLC, versus students, you have to have an idea about the non-profit organization as well. Because I think I have done a mock exam with regards to government university tying up with development. So students, you have to understand the public limited company, their main concern is shareholders' wealth. Understand it very, very well. Their objective is shareholders' wealth. But students, if you see a non-profit or not-for-profit organization or government organization, their understanding is social welfare. So students, you have to always discuss these conflicting challenges as well, because it is very, very important at the end of the day. And then students, another factor is called the SOX, that is the Sarbanes and Oxley Act of United States of America. Now students, don't memorize too much of this, but I just want to say this focuses on auditors independence. Auditors independence. Because currently students, there may be questions on audit, keep in mind, because we don't know anything about the independence of the audit. And also students, within 5 years, auditors must be changed. That is also one factor you have to keep in mind. And also students, if I'm not mistaken, another thing students, auditors needs to give advices, and their advices needs to be taken into consideration, because that is very, very important. Auditors independence. So just remember that SOX is effectively focusing on auditors independence. That's more than enough for the exam point of view. Now students, coming to the next one, just to make sure, this is a theory area, but sometimes they can ask you, there are two types. One is unitary board structure. Now students, unitary board structure is the current board structure of our business. Now, did you observe students, our business is having that tall, wide, narrow organization. Can I write down here Nctech? So Nctech, I'll write down here Nctech in simple language is what students, it's a unitary organization. And then students, there is one more entity or none, it's called, it is effectively called as two-tier board. Two-tier board. Students, this is generally operated in countries like Germany. Just have an idea. So how is two-tier board is very simple students. There are two things. So one is called as the management board, that is the board which is effectively taking the day-to-day activities, like our executive directors, day-to-day activities. And the other one is students, we call it a supervisory board. That is like a very higher level. They design the strategy, everything in simple language. So supervisory board is generally like bank, government, funds, all those things. Now these are like Germany, Japan, all these countries have this. But the issue is these are good for state-owned enterprises. State-owned enterprises. Now, if you see in India, students, there is something called Mysore Sandalwood Soap. Now, for Mysore Sandalwood Soap, because it belongs to Karnataka government, generally in that case, you can go with that application, two-tier boards, like the Tata and Titan. Now, Tamil Nadu government has invested in Tata, so it goes according to that. So, I believe students, it is very clear for you all. So these are just the theoretical aspect that you have to keep in mind, and they may not ask any direct questions from this. So don't worry with regards to that. And the next thing students, the ED, that is executive directors. So can I write down here executive directors, which is one important things to be considered. And then students, we can also say non-executive directors, because students, the segregation is very, very important. And at the end of the day, the non-executive director roles, once it came, their role on strategy, because currently we are in flux, because currently we are only having infrastructure as a service. And then students, their risk approach, how they manage the people, succession planning is important, scrutiny, that means how they design KPIs, everything, so that in that case we can measure the performance of the organization. So I believe this is very, very, very practical at the moment. And also students, just to make your life simple, there are some areas with regards to the threats, if I'm not mistaken. The threats are, students, like example, 9 years, if a person in the board continuously, it's a threat, because you have to somewhat step down. But if you see, it is very clear, explicitly clear, our board of directors, the founders, are more than 9 years, and employees like auditors, everyone, 5 years, they have to change, so these are the main factors that we have to consider, students, in order to make sure the factors are very, very clear for you all at the moment. I believe that everyone is getting that understanding of these threats. Example, another threats should be like personal loans they can take. Now you can use the company assets, and then, students, personal transaction. You have a company, you can sell your company products to your own organization. So those are the issues that the threats can arise if the executive directors and non-executive directors are not properly connected. So keep that in mind. And one more thing, students, board diversity is also one area that you have to keep in mind. And purely exhibit based, students. These are purely exhibit based. Don't memorize anything, purely exhibit based. And just keep your mind free as much as possible, so that you will be able to do properly in the examinations as well. Now, students, just moving to the top. Now, as you know, these are the committees, the remuneration, audit, and nomination. So, just to give you a glance, I'll just write it down here. So, one is called the nomination committee. Now, if you see nomination committee, there can be ED and NED. Because if you want to nominate someone, the EDs also should give some input. And there is something called risk committee. Even risk committee, you can have an executive director and a non-executive director. But the biggest challenge is remuneration, because in remuneration, it is 100% non-executive directors, 100% non-executive directors, and the audit committee is also 100% non-executive directors, 100% non-executive directors. Understand that very, 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 very well. But students, again, I am telling, this paper is not a theory paper. They are not asking you to pinpoint the mistakes, but you have to have this idea to give a solution, and it needs to be practical to the situation, principle based rather than rule based. Now, these are like general rules, what is being mentioned at the moment. So, I believe everyone is very, very clear. Now, students, coming to the remuneration. Now, if you see, students, there needs to be a basic salary. Now, we are not aware what is the salary that is paid. Now, these are loopholes. No, students, we don't know what is the salary that is paid to our board of directors. And then, students, there can be bonus, and then there can be ESOPs, employee share option scheme. And then, students, there can be pension benefits if needed. And then, students, there is something called benefits of kind, like car, everything, students. Now, this can come in an examination. Now, benefits of kind, the directors having lavish cars. Now, institutional investors asking, we have invested 70%, you are only investing 30%. So, I'll write down here one thing. Questions from NED representatives. It's questions from institutional investors representatives. Because I am sure there can be chances institutional investors representatives can effectively influence this decision. Keep that in mind, students. It's very, 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 very important, students, for your understanding. And then, students, I just want to give you some understanding. There is something called, for your understanding, guaranteed bonus. You can just keep that in mind. That means anyway, without any work, you will get a bonus. No target, nothing. Guaranteed bonus. That is the idea. Every year you will get a bonus. And then, students, termination benefits. In case if you terminate the director, you have to pay him a compensation. Then, students, loans to director at a lower price, loans to director, because certain companies have that housing loan, everything is possible for the employees, they give that, students. And then, students, deferred payment means you can get some benefits later, not now, later as well. And also, students, one thing is they are called golden hello, that was just mentioned, but I'll just keep in mind, golden hello is also one factor that you have to keep in mind, students, where the directors from lower or from another company is headhunted. So that is only known as golden hello. Keep that in mind. So that is the pure understanding of the remuneration part, students. And then NEDs, that is non-executive directors, how are their remuneration paid? It's not so complicated, students. It's very simple and easy. They get a basic salary, but their salary is lower than executive directors, lower than ED. Actually, they get lower because they are not full time. Plus, they get something called ESOP for being in the company, for giving their strategy, for being a visionary. They get that ESOP. So, this is the basic understanding of the NED factors at the moment. So, just keep that in mind, students. Now, students, moving into the next area, which is the audit and compliance, students. Now, if you know one thing, students, you have to understand the difference between internal audit. Now, internal audit, if I'm not mistaken, we effectively say management control. That means only the internal factors. But students, external audit, students, it's not management control. If I'm not mistaken, it is stock market control and government control, stock market and compliance control. Because if you are in the stock market, students, external audit is always compulsory. And also, students, annual report, it's very important to have an external audit. So just understand the difference, students, because it is very important for the students to get the ideology of this internal audit and the external audit also. Now, students, if I'm moving forward, just to understand, give you the idea. Now, if you see internal audit, so I'll write down here internal audit. What are their main focus on? So, assisting identification of risk, assisting identification of risk. Now, in case if there's a cyber risk or anything, you need not give more thinking point of view on cyber security technically. Don't write Trojan, don't like malware, don't like ransomware, don't write technical answers. Make sure you are thinking more like an internal auditor. And then, students, review accounting process, because this is very important, because accounting process is important. And then, students, special investigation like fraud, everything, special investigation can come in this, because there are high level chances, example, of a fraud can happen. Special investigation can take place. And then, students, for not for profit organization, there is 3 E's, that is called economy, efficiency, and the other one is known as the effectiveness. Now, if it is a not-for-profit organization, they have to do the 3E. No, for NFP, for an NFP, they have to go with the economy, efficiency, and the effectiveness is very important, students. Not to tell lies, it's very important. And again, remember one thing, everything is based on the exhibit, but just have an idea of this. And then, students, the duties of the audit committee, because it is very important. So what does the audit committee do? Because it is very important. No, students, we have an audit committee, but in the exams they may ask you to prepare a PowerPoint slide asking what are the duties of the audit committee. The duties are oversee work of the internal auditors. One is that, just to oversee the work of internal auditors. Then, students, review work for external audit. So review work for external audit. That is another factor to be considered. And then, students, monitor the financial statements. And then, students, review internal control. So, students, if you observe this very practically, you can understand these are the fundamental things that should be done. And again, students, independence is very important. So can I write down here one important factor is independence. And again, I'm repeating the same thing. Everything depends on the exhibit. This is the idea, because if you observe this section, entire corporate governance is completely useless in Nctech. Very openly saying they are not following anything. The rationale is very clear. 10% owned by the founders and they are dominating the rules. So I believe that is clear. At the moment there is no issues, but in the future you have to think about it, because it is very important. Now, students, risk committee. Now, students, if you observe, currently our business is having so much of risk that is transparently observable, students. Nothing to hide also. So if I'm not mistaken, I'll give you the risk committee duties. That is very, very important now, students. Risk committee duties. Now, in that case, let's write here, raise the risk awareness. Raise the what, students? Risk awareness. That is important now, students. And the next one, students, update the company risk profile. Update the company risk profile. Now, students, you would have observed there is no updation of risk profile until now. We are still the same. Now, this is one thing. And establish. So I'll write down here another point. Establish policies. Establish policies for what, students? Risk management. Establish policies for risk management. And then, students, implement process for monitoring the risk report. Now, students, these are technical jargons what I am explaining, but you have to understand one core element in this, which is known as the accountability factor. So just keep that in mind, students, because it is very, 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 very important, students. And the other thing, students, understanding the risk is very, very important. Example, you will get a risk question for sure, but you have to understand before going into the impact. One is called like operational risk, or is that a tactical risk? Understand the verbs clearly. Operational risk, tactical risk, or the other one is what, students? Strategic risk. Understand the three elements properly. Operational risk, tactical risk, or the strategic risk. That is very, very important. And the other one is generic risk. It is common to all, like inflation, or something like specific risk, like cyber issue directly affecting our business. So you have to understand that. So I'll just give you general risk is, students, inflation. Inflation is common for everyone, but specific risk is, students, data loss from our server, data loss from the server. It's a specific risk, no, students. Understand it, very practical, because it is very, 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 very important in order to make sure you are able to understand it. And then, students, just to go little more in detail, there is something called residual risk. Residual risk means, students, the risk you can't control. Residual risk, the risk you can't control. Risk cannot be controlled. Example, students, in real life, I can give you like bad debt. Bad debt anyway will happen. Labor turnover. Can you control labor turnover? No. Anyway, people will leave the company, right now, student. Labor turnover you can't control, and it is mentioned there is a high number of laborers leaving. It's a residual risk. But how we have to manage it, students? We have to follow something called ALAP model. ALAP means as low as possible, as low as probable, just to as low as reasonably probable, Understand the terms properly, students. That is allowed. That means you have to develop a contingency plan and reduce the impact. Reduce what, students? The impact of occurrence and the likelihood. Impact of occurrence and likelihood. Like insurance can be taken in order to do it, or like blacklist the people from that, because that will reduce it. That is one more thing as well. And then, students, the other thing, just to give you an idea, we have something called the risk audit, just to give you an idea. So, students, a risk audit generally is what you do in the exam. Your 20 marks question is a risk audit question. What you do is that. This is what you do, but don't memorize it, because you know how to do it if you have done a lot of questions in the past papers. So they will give you a set of risks. So the step one, students, step one is identification of risk. That is already given. Correct, no, students? That will be given. Then, students, step two, you have to be skeptical, because it is important. Assess the risk. Look at the term I am using, students. Assess the risk. That means you have to check the likelihood. Look at the term I am using, likelihood, and what, students? Impact. And then, students, after that, students, I'll just move on to the next one. Step 3 is going to be review control. That is, you have to make sure you give a safeguard. what we can do. And then finally, students, the step 4 is the report. The step 4 is the report. That is not given, but the thing is, students, if you see state, you have to do this assessment in the examination. So please make sure you are competent. And in order to do a risk assessment or risk audit, your mind needs to be free. Your mind needs to be free. You have to forget all the mocks you have did. You have to think very much specific to the exhibit in order to do this risk audit area. So I believe this gives you a better clarity at the moment. And then students, I just want to give you a quick idea about some terms, if I'm not mistaken. There is something called risk attitude. Just keep in mind, students, risk attitude. That is broken into three. One is called risk averse. Now, if you see our NEDs, they don't take risk. People who don't take risk is risk averse. Then students, risk aggressive. They people who love to take risk. And then students, other one is risk neutral. Risk neutral are the generalized people. They don't take high risk. They just keep their self as it is. So risk attitude, risk averse, risk aggressive, risk neutral. So these are the risk attitude. And then students, there is something called risk capacity for your understanding. Now risk capacity means financial capacity, because that is very, very important, no students. Now if you observe, one thing, if you see in the case study, it is clearly mentioned what is that Nctech is only in Falun. So can I write down here Nctech is only in Falun. Nctech is only in what, students? Is only in what, students? Falun. Keep that in mind, students. So that is one challenge for us. Nctech is only in Falun. So the biggest challenge for us is, can we compete? Can we compete with international rivals? Because that question can come. International rivals coming into Falun, international like Dropbox, like some companies come like that and give free or cheaper product. We have to be very, 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 very careful with that for your understanding, just to keep that in mind. So the risk attitude and the risk capacity, if you take the total, we call it as risk appetite, the stomach of the organization, the full capacity. And based on the risk appetite, we have to manage the risk strategy. That only I explained you, students, the risk audit. And then after you do the audit also, there will be a risk which can't be controlled, that is residual risk. And for the residual risk, what you have to do is you have to go for the alert. That is as low as reasonably possible contingency plan. Try to make it less and less. That is one thing for your understanding. And the person who is in charge for operational is risk manager. Keep that in mind. Now students, one more thing, just to make your life simple. This is called as the risk assurance mapping. So I'll just write down here the risk assurance mapping. Now in the exam, students, they may not ask you this. Keep that in mind. You will never get a single question in the examination where you have to prepare this. But there are chances they may ask you to design a framework using risk assurance map. So it is designed into level, the 3 lines, students. So the first line is, students, just to give you an idea, whenever you are designing something, you have to design internal controls for day-to-day operations, Now example, students, biometric. Now if you see, biometric is day-to-day operation. Now students, people come every day, punch in their fingerprint and they go out. So day-to-day, that is control framework and management review. You give the approval. Then students, the second line, if I'm not mistaken, is again the next point. The second line is, students, oversee the process. That means internally, some supervision must be there. Whether people are coming, are they doing it? A follow-up must be there. And the third line is very practical. That is the internal audit. Because internal audit is again important, whether the supervisors are also following the rules and regulation properly. And the final one is the external audit, because that is the fourth line. Because after the internal audit is also strong, the external audit also should say it is done, and then they can also provide a second opinion called assurance in that point. So students, are you clear with this understanding of the risk assurance mapping? I believe that is very, very clear for the students at the moment. And again, students, don't memorize this, but you have to design an answer for a PPT or something using these headings only. So don't memorize all these things in that. Exhibit matters. And the last one is, students, external reporting, favorite area of the examiner, sure question can come. So can I write down here, students, sure question, because there are high chances this area is tested. So ISO 14001. Students, just to give you one thing, that is focusing on sustainable audit, and then students, if I'm not mistaken, EMAS is also there, eco management audit scheme. And then students, if I'm not mistaken, there is something called economy, environment and social, that is one more factor on voluntary reporting. And then students, integrated reporting is also one area. Now I will just write down these things for your understanding. And then students, there is something called triple bottom line, that is effectively focusing on three areas, that is people, planet, and profit. So students, these are the external reporting areas that a student needs to be aware of. But the mistake what they do is they write down everything. Now, example, integrated reporting, the students will write all the capitals. Please don't write all the capitals, headings, no. You have to always write assess. The verb will be assess or the verb will be analyze. Then students, you have to identify what can be the future, what can be the future values, what can be the future development, and please avoid going for a pure theory answer here. And also students, there is an area called assurance, because audit may be there but assurance is not there generally in many of these cases. And then students, if I'm not mistaken, reliability issues. And then you have to design some own KPIs, that is industry related KPI. Can you remember security breach? Can you remember, students, security breach? Now that is an industry related KPI. And then students, can you remember service availability? Can you remember that was there, a graph was given, that is an industry related KPI. So likewise you have to think, and this can be the question number 3 with financial analysis part 2. But don't copy paste the answers from any past examination. Again, I am telling you, what matters at the end of the day is the exhibit that you do and how you appraise it. So students, this is the complete picture of the corporate governance area. Technically sure questions. If you can analyze this properly, around 40 marks you can easily gain from these recaps of these things, students. And please go through the educational hub for getting the more information of this. And I believe it is very clear for you all. Good luck, students. Thank you very much.